Seattle General in Norfolk smells like antiseptic and burned coffee at 0600 when Danielle Ross clocks in for her shift. Third floor. Pediatrics and post-op, where the nurses are younger and hungrier and willing to volunteer for the cases that make their names shine in the monthly performance reviews. She's been here 3 years, watching the same pattern repeat itself. A young nurse catches sepsis early in a post-op patient. Rounds happen. Attending physicians ask the young nurse questions. The young nurse answers. 3 months later, the young nurse has a commendation in her file and a letter from the chief of medicine praising her clinical instincts and exemplary observational skills. What the file never mentions is that Danielle Ross is the one who flagged the elevated lactate, the subtle change in skin perfusion, the tachycardia that didn't match the patient's pain level. She's the one who whispered to the young nurse during vitals check, his breathing changed. Count the respirations. She's the one who knows how to read a patient like a field report, every vital sign a sentence, every symptom a paragraph, every decline a warning written in real time. But the file has her name listed as assigned nurse. Nothing more. The morning intercom crackles at 0647 as she's checking for sites in room 312, her hands moving with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't forget even when the mind tries to bury it. 15 years of nursing. Before that, 14 years in Air Force Blues. Hands that have started fours in the dark with only red-filtered flashlight, hands that have done chest compressions on soldiers bleeding out in a dust-choked tent in Ramadi, hands that learned to do everything exactly right because doing it wrong meant a mother somewhere got a folded flag instead of a son. The 4 slides in at first attempt, a 20-gauge angiocath in a patient with marginal veins, and the older patient exhales in relief because the pain of the stick is over. Danielle secures the tape with efficient, practiced movements. She doesn't tell the patient it was easy. She doesn't mention she's done this maybe 4,000 times. She just smiles, tells him to press the call button if he needs anything, and moves to the next room. The intercom hisses again. Danny the Band-Aid girl to the emergency department. Danny the Band-Aid girl. The voice of Dr. Ashford, chief of medicine, deliberately distorted by the hospital's aged public address system. The words come through the speakers above the nurse's station where at least 15 staff members are standing, charting, answering phones, checking medication times. The phrasing is almost professional, almost plausible as a page, except for the 0.3-second pause before Band-Aid girl, the micro-emphasis that transforms a nickname into a humiliation, and the background laughter, audible, deliberate, unmistakable, of colleagues laughing at the joke. She's learned that the laughter is the point. The name itself is just the delivery mechanism. Danielle continues writing her notes. Room 312, post-operative abdominal reconstruction, vital stable, for patent, no complaints of pain beyond expected range. Her handwriting is precise, the letters formed with military efficiency. A resident passes by her and smirks. One of the young nurses glances sideways, checking to see if she's reacted. Danielle hasn't. Her jaw is the same as it was 5 seconds ago. Her breathing hasn't changed. Her hands are steady on the pen, the way they're steady on every difficult task. 3 years of practice at this specific discipline, the art of being invisible while doing essential work. She finishes the note, clips the chart back into place, and walks to the emergency department. The elevator ride takes 42 seconds. She uses them to breathe. Not deeply, not with obvious intention, just the normal breathing of a person walking through a hospital corridor at 06:08 on a Tuesday morning. Her shoulder aches where shrapnel tracked through soft tissue and muscle 14 years ago, a low-level throb that gets worse when it rains and absolutely worse when her cortisol spikes. Today is already not going to be a good day for her shoulder. She can feel it in the pre-pressure of the pain, the way it knows what's coming before she does. The emergency department is controlled chaos. 2 patients in trauma bays, 1 in triage, 3 more in the waiting area holding ice packs and clutching their children. A nurse, someone named Marcus, she thinks, though he's new enough that she hasn't learned his full rotation pattern yet, waves her over. We've got a full house and Ashford's in a mood. Commander just came in, septic shock, training accident, whole 9 yards. You're going to want to check his chart because his pressures are already bottoming out. Danielle moves to the chart before her conscious mind finishes processing the words. Training accident. Coast Guard. The electronic display shows a name and a photo, official military ID, and her stomach drops like she's just missed a step on a staircase she's walked 1,000 times. Commander James Vickers. Commanding Officer, Sector Columbia River, United States Coast Guard. The man Ryan calls surf in a way that means something, a specific kind of respect that teenagers reserve for people they believe in absolutely. The man who came to Ryan's 18th birthday party in dress uniform and told Danielle in the kitchen, quietly, while refilling his water glass, that her son had been recommended for the academy, that his references would be strong, that he saw something in the kid. 12 words, and they had erased every single doubt Danielle carried about whether her son would be okay, about whether losing his father to a car accident when he was 4 years old meant he'd be broken in ways that no mother could repair. Commander Vickers had said I see something in him and meant it as a serious statement, delivered with the kind of gravity that only comes from someone who knows what excellence looks like and knows how to measure it. The chart details blur as her eyes move across the screen. Temperature 39.7 Celsius. Blood pressure 94/58 and trending down. Lactate 6.2. White blood cell count 18.9 thousand. Heart rate 127, tachycardic and rising. The patient is in septic shock, the cascade of infection triggering a systemic inflammatory response that's shutting down his body's ability to maintain its own blood pressure, his own oxygen delivery, his own survival. If they can't reverse the infection and restore perfusion to his organs within the next few hours, his kidneys will fail. Then his liver. Then his heart will give up. The progression is as predictable as it is remorseless. Danielle has seen it before. Many times. Enough times that she can recite the progression backward in her sleep. She moves to Trauma Bay 3 without being asked, and there he is. Commander Vickers looks nothing like the man who came to the birthday party. That man stood straight and moved with the kind of controlled precision that only comes from military discipline. This man is confused. Delirious. Sweat-soaked despite the fact that the Trauma Bay is kept at exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit. His eyes are moving constantly, focusing on nothing, seeing things that aren't in the room. In his right hand, curled against his chest like a talisman, is a dog tag on a broken chain. The metal catches the fluorescent light as his arm trembles. His lips are moving, but the words coming out aren't coherent, just a murmur of syllables and fragments that might have been words before the fever and the toxins rewrote his brain's ability to produce language. Captain, someone says, and it takes Danielle a moment to realize it's the young resident, Marcus, speaking. Captain, can you hear me? Can you tell me what happened? It's not Captain. It's Commander. But Danielle doesn't correct him because this isn't the moment for it, and more importantly, she's already gone quiet inside. The way she goes quiet before a casualty arrives in a field hospital tent. The way she goes quiet when decisions have to be perfect and there's no time to second-guess them. She checks the for that's already been started, peripheral line, too small, will need to be upgraded, and pulls on gloves with a single efficient motion. The latex snaps as she stretches it over her palm, a sound like a whip crack that pulls her attention onto what needs to happen next. Vickers needs fluids. Large bore 4, central line placement probably unavoidable, broad-spectrum antibiotics while they wait for blood cultures to identify what's trying to kill him, vasopressors to support his blood pressure if fluids don't restore perfusion. None of that matters yet. What matters right now is that his blood pressure is 89/52, oxygen saturation is 94% on a non-rebreather mask, and the machine at the head of the bed shows a heart rate that's climbing, 134, 136, 138. Tachycardia is a sign that his body is beginning to fail its basic functions. It's the canary in the coal mine. It's the warning before the crash. Dr. Ashford appears at 0701, moving through the trauma bay with the kind of deliberate confidence that belongs to someone who has never questioned his own authority. His eyes pass over Danielle without registering her, and instead focus on Marcus. History, he demands. Marcus fumbles with the chart. Training exercise yesterday morning. Cold water immersion drill. He started complaining of fatigue around 1800 hours, fever at 0400. EMS found him at 0530, already confused. Aspiration pneumonia, probably. Cold water inhalation, bacteria colonizing the lungs, the infection racing through the bloodstream faster than the immune system can organize a response. It's common enough in military training scenarios. Dangerous enough that it kills maybe 3% of people who get it if they're young and healthy like Vickers appears to be. Much higher percentage if they're unlucky. Much higher if they don't get treatment exactly right. Start broad-spec antibiotics, Ashford says, and he's already walking away. Vancomycin, Zocin. Get a central line. Push fluids at 30 milliliters per kilogram. And someone get me a better history than that. He didn't just wake up septic. He doesn't look at Danielle. Doesn't ask for her assessment. Doesn't make eye contact. And she understands immediately that this is stage 2. The strategic dismantling is already in progress, though he doesn't know yet what Vickers means to her, or what she means to Ryan, or that the moment she laid eyes on that dog tag, this situation became something more dangerous than a routine septic shock case. The intercom crackles overhead at 0702 as she's prepping the bedside for central line insertion. Danny the Band-Aid girl, phone call at the nurse's station. Danny the Band-Aid girl. There is no phone call. She knows there's no phone call. The joke is that she'll go to the station expecting a call that doesn't exist, that she'll be humiliated in front of whoever's standing nearby, that the laughter will follow. It's happened before. It will happen again. She ignores it. Focuses on laying out the supplies for central line placement, on checking the clock, on counting the seconds since Vickers' blood pressure dropped to dangerous numbers. 40 seconds have passed. His pressure will be lower by now. The infection will be tunneling deeper into his organs. Everything is happening faster than it should. And then Dr. Ashford is beside her, so close she can smell the coffee on his breath, and his voice is low enough that only she can hear the words. Your performance reviews show a pattern of overstepping your scope of practice. You've been flagged for independent decision-making beyond your licensed role. His words come out smooth as ice, rehearsed, the kind of threat that's been polished through multiple uses. If you provide care to this patient beyond basic vitals and for monitoring, I will have your license suspended before your shift ends. I have documentation. I have support from the hospital attorney. Do we understand each other? Danielle doesn't look at him. She's focused on the triple lumen catheter kit, on the ultrasound machine being wheeled into position, on the way Vickers' chest is moving too fast, breathing at a rate that's no longer normal human respiration but something closer to panic. 38 breaths per minute. His body is already failing. Already beginning the cascade that ends in organ shutdown. She pulls on fresh gloves. Doesn't respond. Doesn't acknowledge. Doesn't give him the satisfaction of watching her face change. Ashford waits exactly 3 seconds for a response that doesn't come, then walks away with his shoulders slightly higher than they were before, a man who has just established dominance through professional threat. The kind of threat that works because she has a medical license, because she has bills, because she has a son in his senior year of high school who's planning to attend the academy on a recommendation from the man currently dying in front of her. The next 6 hours pass in controlled crisis. Vickers is intubated by the pulmonologist at 08 for 3, a 7.5 endotracheal tube placed smoothly past his vocal cords, then secured with meticulous care. Antibiotics are running. 2 liters of normal saline have been pushed through a wide-bore central line that Danielle placed at 0714, her hands moving through muscle memory that doesn't need permission from anyone, her fingers finding the femoral vein through anatomical landmarks that her body learned to feel through a stethoscope in a tent under artillery fire. The procedure took 3 minutes and 47 seconds. No complications. No second attempt necessary. The kind of work that makes other nurses blink and ask, "How are you so fast?" The kind of work that belongs on a resume, except that saying she did it would violate Ashford's explicit threat and she's not about to test whether he meant it. By 1400 hours, Vickers is stable enough that he can be transferred to the ICU. His blood pressure has improved to 98/61, still low but no longer in the immediate danger zone. His oxygen saturation is climbing. The infection will still be a fight, sepsis always is, but he has a chance now. A real chance. The kind of chance you get when someone reads the subtle changes in a patient's condition before those changes become catastrophic. At shift change, 1,600 hours exactly, Danielle is in the parking lot with 11 other staff members, moving toward the employee lot with her bag slung over her shoulder. The rain started at 15:30, a cold Norfolk drizzle that smells like salt water and diesel exhaust from the commercial dock 3 miles away. She's a dozen steps from her car when Dr. Ashford's voice stops her. Danielle. She turns. He's standing with his arms crossed, his expression positioned somewhere between disappointed and stern, the way a parent looks at a child who's made a choice they warned against. There are 12 other people in the parking lot. She can count them without turning her head: 2 residents, 3 nurses, 4 med students, a physical therapist, a phlebotomist, and the hospital's security chief. All of them are now watching to see what happens next. Your role is being restructured, Ashford announces, loud enough for everyone to hear. Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to overnight triage in the emergency department. You'll be working 2,100 to 900 hours, 5 days a week. This is a disciplinary action based on the pattern we discussed. It's not negotiable. Your new schedule starts tomorrow. You can pick up your updated assignment sheet from HR in the morning. The words are delivered with perfect professional inflection, the tone you use when you're documenting something that will later be shown to a legal team. The message underneath the words is clear: she's been demoted. She's been benched. She's been removed from the floor where she was making the people around her look bad through her competence. Rain drips from her hair. She doesn't brush it away. Doesn't speak. Doesn't let her expression change. Just exhales, a long measured breath that comes from somewhere deeper than her lungs, and holds his gaze with the kind of stillness that only comes from a decade and a half of learning to breathe through impossible situations. And then she speaks, and her voice is quiet enough that most of the parking lot has to lean in to hear it, which makes them listen harder. You froze when his pressure dropped to 60/40, she says. You were standing 3 feet from his monitor when the systolic hit the floor, and you called for another bag of fluids and ordered a second round of vancomycin without ordering vasopressors, without ordering a central line, without doing the work that actually stops septic shock. And you froze because you don't know what to do when the standard protocol isn't moving fast enough. The parking lot goes silent. Even the rain seems to pause. You didn't freeze because you're a bad doctor, Danielle continues, her voice still quiet, her eyes still locked on his. You froze because you're afraid of what it looks like when someone else does their job better than you do. And you're trying to remove me so that next time, and there will be a next time, because the Coast Guard has 17,000 personnel and training accidents are like death and taxes, they always come back around. Next time he'll be the one who doesn't make it, and you won't have to admit that you know exactly how to read a patient. You just choose not to. She walks past him toward her car. Doesn't look back. Doesn't wait for a response. Just gets in the car, starts the engine, and drives out of the parking lot while the rain intensifies and the wind shakes the vehicle like something is trying to get in. Behind her, in the rearview mirror, Dr. Ashford is still standing in the parking lot, alone now, his mouth open, his hands at his sides, looking very much like a man who has just realized he's made a mistake. But that realization hasn't translated into wisdom yet. Not even close. The night shift started at 2,200 hours with the smell of antiseptic and understaffed silence. Danielle pushed through the employee entrance on the 3rd floor, her badge catching the fluorescent light, and immediately felt the absence. The ICU wing was a skeleton crew, 2 nurses where there should have been 4, the surgical resident's desk empty, the on-call surgeon station dark. The staffing board told the story without words: surgical resident reassigned to trauma, night supervisor pulled to pediatrics, the graveyard shift tilted deliberately in one direction. Away from the ICU. Away from her. Amy waited by the triage station, a first-year nurse with kind eyes and the unmistakable stiffness of someone who'd been warned. She couldn't have been more than 24, her scrub still crisp, her name badge shining like she'd polished it that morning. She glanced up when Danielle arrived, then immediately backed down at her tablet, the gesture a reflex, don't make eye contact, don't get involved. Danielle had seen this before. Fear spreads faster than any virus. You and me tonight. Danielle kept her voice level, a simple question that wasn't. Amy nodded, her fingers tightening on the tablet's edge. Dr. Ashford said we're to handle triage and basic vitals only. He was very specific about the scope. There it was. The word scope, weaponized. Not the medical term, the threat. Danielle's entire career compressed into a single syllable. She'd heard it differently once, when a battalion commander had said, "Major, I need you operating beyond your scope tonight. Lives depend on it." Different century. Different man. Same word meaning everything. The night stretched ahead like a corridor with no exit. Danielle walked to the staffing station and pulled up the overnight schedule on the hospital system, her eyes moving across the grid of names and assignments. The surgical resident, Dr. Patterson, competent, someone she'd worked with before, was listed on the trauma floor until 0600. The on-call surgeon, Dr. Chen, was marked available but with a note, do not contact for non-critical cases. Dr. Ashford's directive. Non-critical. Commander James Vickers, septic, multi-organ failure beginning, was apparently non-critical. She pulled up his vitals from the ICU monitor. Blood pressure 82/54. Oxygen saturation 91%. Temperature 103.8. Heart rate 106. The numbers painted a picture, a man being slowly erased, system by system, like fog dissolving from a windshield. Most nurses would have walked away. Most people, given the choice between their job and a stranger, would have kept their mouth shut. Danielle had already chosen differently once, in a tent in Ramadi with mortars walking down the compound wall, and she'd chosen it again a dozen times since, and every time the calculation was the same, which decision lets you sleep, and which one doesn't. She closed the window on the schedule. Amy was watching her with the careful stillness of a bird that sensed a predator nearby. They told you not to go up there, didn't they? Danielle asked. Not exactly. Amy's voice was small, measured. Dr. Ashford said if anyone needed ICU support, he should be contacted first. That we weren't to escalate without his approval. Danielle understood the shape of that lie. It wasn't a prohibition, those were easier to defy. It was a process, a bureaucratic wall that looked reasonable on paper but functioned as a cage. Call Dr. Ashford, wait for approval, meanwhile the patient's blood pressure continued its slow collapse. By the time permission came, if it came, Vickers would be a medical inevitability instead of a man who could still be saved. The rain started around 22:30, hammering the ER entrance glass like it was trying to break through to somewhere warmer. The sound filled the quiet of the station, percussion that marked time, that counted down the hours. Danielle worked the triage desk with Amy beside her, handling the minor injuries that came through overnight, a dislocated shoulder, a laceration that needed sutures, an elderly man with chest pain who turned out to have indigestion, though they ran the full EKG anyway because the protocol existed for a reason and protocols existed because people had died when they didn't. At 23:50, during the lull when even emergency rooms seemed to exhale, Danielle made her move. She told Amy she was taking her break, grabbing coffee from the third-floor break room. It wasn't a lie, just a route that took her past the ICU. The doors opened with a soft hiss of pressurized air, and she stepped into the unit like she was walking into someone else's dream. The monitors beeped in their steady rhythm, O2 machines hissing, ventilators whooshing, the ambient sound of bodies being kept alive by electricity and chemistry and willpower. Vickers was in the corner room, the one that had a window overlooking the parking lot. His chest rose and fell with the ventilator's mechanical breathing, his skin the color of old concrete. The dog tag was still there, hanging against his hospital gown, the broken chain, the single piece of metal that meant something to someone, though Danielle didn't know what it meant to him. She'd seen enough combat casualty care to know that talismans meant everything and nothing, that a man could hold onto a photograph or a letter or a piece of metal while his organs were systematically failing. She didn't touch him. That would have been overstepping. Instead, she checked the monitors from the nursing station, vitals visible on the screen without her laying hands on the patient. BP 78/48. Falling. The oxygen sat had dropped to 88% despite the ventilator's best efforts. His core temperature was climbing, 104.2. The infection wasn't responding to antibiotics because it was already too systemic, already winning. Most ICU nurses would have called the attending, would have followed protocol, would have escalated through the proper channels. Danielle had followed proper channels in a field hospital while a 19-year-old Marine bled out waiting for authorization to move him to surgery. She'd watched the clock tick, watched the proper channels move with glacial precision, and watched a kid from Colorado die because nobody wanted to deviate from the process. The memory lived in her shoulder, the scar tissue was thick, ropey, a physical reminder of shrapnel and mortality and the moment she'd decided that some protocols deserved to be broken. She found the on-call surgeon's number on the ICU directory. Dr. Chen. She dialed the hospital direct line, and it rang 3 times before a sleepy voice answered. "This is Chen." "Dr. Chen, this is Nurse Ross from Seattle General. ICU patient James Vickers, Commander Coast Guard, currently septic with multi-organ failure. Blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation declining, fever unresponsive to current antibiotics. I'm recommending we escalate to you for evaluation." There was a pause. Not the pause of a doctor considering treatment options. The pause of a doctor who'd already received contradictory instructions. "I received a directive from Dr. Ashford," Chen said carefully, "that Commander Vickers is not to be treated as a surgical candidate. That his condition is terminal. His pressure's at 78/48, Danielle said. Terminal is something that happens when you stop treating it. Another pause. Longer. "I've been instructed not to come in for this patient." She hung up without saying goodbye. The phone felt heavy in her hand, like it was weighted with all the ways protocols could fail, all the reasons a competent doctor wouldn't walk into a fight that wasn't his to win. Dr. Chen was protecting his job. Most people did. Most people chose survival over heroism, and Danielle couldn't blame them because she'd made that choice too. 3 years of keeping her head down, accepting the humiliations, saying nothing. But her son's commanding officer was dying on the 3rd floor, and somewhere in the calculation was the weight of a debt that couldn't be unpaid, a recommendation that had changed a 17-year-old boy's trajectory, a moment when someone had looked at a kid and said, "Yes, you could be better than this." She went back to the triage desk. Amy was charting an intake form, her concentration absolute, a fortress of not seeing and not knowing. Danielle sat down without speaking, and for the next 3 hours, she worked through the night as if she was just a nurse in a hospital that followed protocols, just a woman taking vitals and updating charts and existing in the space that had been assigned to her. She didn't think about Commander Vickers. She didn't think about Ryan waiting at home. She didn't think about any of it. At 0145, the monitor alarm went off. The sound cut through the triage station like a knife, not the soft alert tone that meant something was slightly off, but the urgent, escalating shriek that meant the boundaries between alive and dying had collapsed. Danielle was moving before her conscious mind registered the sound, her body already standing, already turning toward the ICU. Amy's eyes widened, the question forming on her lips, the protocol, the fear, but Danielle was already gone, moving with the fluid precision of someone who'd made this calculation before and found the answer the same way every time. She pushed through the ICU doors. The monitor was screaming. Vickers' blood pressure had crashed, not gradually but catastrophically, dropping into the territory where the body simply shuts down its outlying systems and tries to protect only the brain and heart. 75/30. 62/28. The numbers were descending like an elevator with a severed cable. The night nurse on duty was already at the bedside, Martinez, experienced, capable, and she was reaching for the crash cart when Danielle appeared beside her. Ashford said not to escalate, Martinez said. Not as an excuse. As a statement of fact, a wall she'd been told not to cross. I know. Danielle's voice had dropped an octave. I'm here now. The room went to work. Martinez didn't ask questions. She'd been in healthcare long enough to recognize the shift, the moment when protocols became optional and triage became triage in its oldest form. Who will die if I do nothing, and can I live with myself if I choose that option? The crash cart rolled close. Danielle was already mentally assessing, already calculating what needed to happen in what order, already feeling the muscle memory waking up, hands that had held lives together, that had improvised surgery in the dark with what was available, that had moved with the particular competence that only came from having already seen the worst that could happen. Vickers' oxygen saturation was 71%. His heart rate was dropping, 166, 142, 128, the slow surrender of an exhausted system. The infection had overwhelmed his body's ability to maintain pressure, his vessels dilating, his blood pooling in all the wrong places, his organs beginning their cascade failure like dominoes pushed by an invisible hand. 2 of Epi-4 push, Danielle said. Her voice wasn't a request. It was a command. The kind of command that came from somewhere deeper than rank, from the place where decisions had already been made before words were spoken. Martinez was already drawing it up. Adrenaline. Epinephrine. The chemical equivalent of screaming at the body to keep functioning, to fight back against the infection, to remember how to be alive. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping the fall line. The medication flowing through the system. Nothing. The monitor continued its descent. 56/28. Heart rate, 108, dropping steadily toward the terminal quiet. Danielle was already reaching for the crash cart, her hands moving with the kind of certainty that came only from having no other choice, from being the person in the room who'd seen this movie before and knew how it ended if nobody interrupted the narrative. She'd broken rules before. She'd broken them for a reason. She'd broken them in a tent with mortars walking the walls, and she'd break them now, in the fluorescent silence of a hospital room where nobody was watching, where the only witness was a machine screaming its electronic alarm. Amy, she called out, not looking back. I need you to trust me for the next 12 hours. The monitor screamed. Not the steady beep 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 of routine surveillance. This was the flat, panicked wail of a heart that had stopped talking. At 0200 hours exactly, Commander Vickers' cardiac rhythm collapsed into ventricular fibrillation, a desperate electrical storm with no forward motion, no perfusion, no life. Danielle was 3 beds away, checking fluid levels on a septic patient whose fever had finally broken. She heard the alarm before she saw it. The sound cuts through a hospital like nothing else, that particular shriek that makes every nurse's body move before her brain catches up. She was moving. Already moving. The monitor showed chaos. VFib. The kind of rhythm that meant minutes, not hours. Maybe less. Get the crash cart, Danielle called to Amy, the first-year resident who'd been assigned as her only backup for the entire night shift, a decision no one had questioned because everyone understood its purpose. Isolation. Danielle alone with a dying man and a nurse fresh enough to panic. Amy was already running. Danielle's hands were on Vickers' chest before the cart was in the room. Ribs beneath her palms. Still warm. Still a person. She began chest compressions with the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, who understood that compressions were just borrowed time, borrowed heartbeats while someone else solved the real problem. Charge to 200, Danielle said, but she was already reaching for the defibrillator pads. Amy fumbled with the adhesive backing, her hands shaking. 18 years old in a nurse's uniform, drowning in the first real code of her career. Charging, Danielle said, though no one had charged anything. The pads were ready. She positioned them, one below the right collarbone, one below the left armpit, where every textbook said they should go. Her hands moved like they belonged to someone else, someone who'd rehearsed this 10,000 times. Clear. Everyone stepped back. The shock jolted Vickers' body like electricity finding ground. His back arched. His arms flexed. For one perfect second, the monitor flatlined completely. Then nothing. V-fib again. The same desperate chaos. Resume compressions, Danielle said, and her hands were back on his chest, counting 1, 2, 3, 4. The compressions had a rhythm, almost musical. Squeeze the heart manually. Push blood through vessels. Buy time. Buy oxygen. By the surgeon who was supposed to be on the way. Page the on-call surgical team again, Danielle said to Amy, who was standing rigid, staring at the monitor like it might change if she believed hard enough. Already did. No answer. No answer. Of course. No answer because Ashford had made calls, specific, surgical calls designed to move chess pieces around a board. Danielle understood this now with the kind of clarity that comes from having worked in places where the rules were life and death, where every decision had weight. He'd locked them out. Not physically. Administratively. The surgical team wouldn't respond because Ashford had already told them not to. The on-call surgeon had been reassigned. The residents had been moved to different floors. The anesthesia team had no callbacks. It was perfect sabotage, the kind that would look like an ordinary night gone wrong, like a tragedy no one could have prevented. Except someone could have prevented it. Danielle's hands kept moving. Compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The muscles in her shoulders burned. Her old wound, shrapnel from Ramadi, a convoy ambush that had nearly ended her career in the Air Force, screamed with every thrust downward. She pushed through it. Pain was information. Pain meant her body was still working, still fighting, still capable. 2 minutes with no response, Amy whispered. Her voice was trembling. Her first code. The man on the table was already dead in her mind. Danielle could see it written in the set of her shoulders, the way her eyes had gone glassy. She'd already decided to let him go. Danielle had decided something different. She could keep doing compressions until the official code time expired, until someone senior enough arrived to call it, until Vickers became a statistic in Ashford's file, another unfortunate outcome, nothing negligent, nothing wrong. Seattle General's mortality rate would tick up by 1. An autopsy might happen. An investigation probably wouldn't. Or she could do what she hadn't done since she'd left the military. Amy, Danielle said, her voice dropping to the register that people listened to without knowing why. Open that crash cart. Bottom drawer. Get me the scalpel set and 4.0 silk sutures. Amy's eyes went wider. That's not, Danielle, you can't. Get them. There was something in Danielle's tone that made Amy move faster than panic. Muscle memory. The kind of obedience that came from hearing a voice that had earned the right to be obeyed. Amy's hands shook as she pulled the sterile packet from the drawer. What are you doing? Amy's voice was very small. Danielle didn't answer. She was already thinking in a different language, the one she'd learned when the ceiling was canvas and the floor was sand, when a 26-year-old Air Force major with a scalpel and a prayer had to save lives with nothing but improvisation and will. Emergency thoracotomy. It wasn't in the scope of practice for a nurse. It wasn't approved. It wasn't authorized. It was also the only thing keeping Commander James Vickers alive. She found the space between his ribs, the 4th and 5th intercostal space, left anterior lateral thoracotomy approach. Muscle memory didn't ask permission. Her hands knew this anatomy. 40 times she'd done this procedure in Ramadi, in a field hospital where the concrete walls shook from mortar fire and the blood on the floor never had time to dry. 40 times she'd opened a chest cavity and manually massaged a heart back to life while incoming rounds shredded the tent above them. The scalpel made a sound like nothing else. A small sound. A surgical whisper. The skin parted. Then fascia. Then ribs. Amy made a noise like a wounded animal, but Danielle was already reaching into the chest cavity, her gloved hand finding the pericardium, the thin membrane surrounding the heart. She tore it open with her fingers. No time for elegant technique. Just need. The heart was ice cold. Unresponsive. Dying. She held it in her palm, a human heart, beating weakly or not beating at all, nestled in her hand like a trapped bird. She began to squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. Manual cardiac massage. The kind of thing they taught in combat medicine courses that most doctors never had to actually do. 40 compressions, Amy. Call them out, Danielle said. Amy's voice was barely audible, but she counted, 1, 2, 3. Danielle squeezed the heart. Released. Squeezed again. The organ was becoming warmer in her hand, responding to the stimulation, to the oxygen being forced through it with every compression. She worked without looking at the monitor, without thinking about the fact that she was breaking every rule that governed civilian medicine, every law that protected the boundaries of her scope. This wasn't nursing. This was something older. Something primal. Something that didn't care about bureaucracy or licensing boards or ambitious doctors with political allies. She worked. 38, 39, 40. Danielle continued the massage, her breath coming hard now, her shoulder screaming with every movement. The scar tissue in her deltoid was tearing. She could feel it. She pushed through it the way she'd learned to push through everything, by pretending the pain belonged to someone else. Amy was counting again. The monitor was still showing chaos, still showing a heart that wasn't generating its own rhythm, still showing a man who was dead unless Danielle's hand could teach his organ how to live again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At 0237 hours, something changed. Danielle felt it first, a flutter beneath her palm, a tremor, a suggestion of autonomous rhythm. Her fingers transmitted the sensation directly to her brain without translation. The heart was thinking about beating on its own. At 0243 hours, the monitor showed sinus rhythm. A single, steady line of life. 1 beat. 2 beats. 3. The electrical system had rebooted. The mechanical pump had remembered its job. It's working, Amy breathed. Danielle was already working on closure. Her hands knew the pattern, silk sutures through fascia, through ribs, through skin. The incision she'd made was beginning to bleed in a controlled way now, which meant there was blood pressure again, which meant there was perfusion again, which meant that the man on the table had moved from corpse to patient. The heart beneath her hands beat steadily. Steadily. Alive. She finished the last suture at 0247 hours, her hand shaking now, not from fear, but from adrenaline and the acute realization of what she'd just done. Performed a procedure that would cost her license if witnessed. Violated every professional boundary. Saved a man's life in violation of direct orders. Vickers' chest rose and fell. The ventilator hummed. His oxygen saturation climbed, 78. 82, 88. 94, his heart rate held steady at 98 beats per minute. His blood pressure stabilized. He was breathing on his own. Responsive. Alive. Danielle stripped off her gloves with deliberate precision and documented everything with clinical accuracy, writing out the procedure, the times, the vital signs, the response. Not hiding anything. Not pretending it hadn't happened. Recording it like evidence, which it was. Evidence that she'd performed the procedure. Evidence that it had worked. Evidence that would, by morning, ensure her termination. She'd known that when the scalpel made that first incision. But the man was alive. At 0400 hours, the ICU door opened. Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway, his tailored charcoal suit still pristine despite the hour, his tie perfectly aligned. His eyes moved across the room, the opened crash cart, the surgical drapes, the closed incision, the monitor showing a heart beating in perfect sinus rhythm, and finally, Danielle, standing beside the bed with her hands still shaking. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator breathing. At 0400 hours, Dr. Ashford walked into the ICU like a man expecting to see a body. His shoes were expensive Italian leather, the kind that cost more than most nurses made in a month. The fluorescent lights caught the silver in his hair as his eyes moved across the room, the opened crash cart, the surgical instrument still laid out on the tray, the incision closed with precise sutures, the monitor displaying a heart beating in perfect sinus rhythm. His gaze finally landed on Danielle, standing beside the bed with her hand still steady, her expression neutral as a soldier at attention. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator breathing. Ashford's face shifted through 3 distinct expressions in as many seconds. First, shock, his jaw tightened, his pupils dilated. Then calculation, his eyes moving from the closed incision to Danielle's hands to the crash cart to the surgical drapes she'd used. Finally, something cold and precise settled behind his eyes, like a predator recognizing a threat it hadn't known existed. He stepped closer to the bed, studying the suture work without touching anything. His voice, when it came, was almost conversational. Almost impressed. "You performed a thoracotomy. As a nurse." It wasn't a question. Danielle said nothing. She had learned long ago that words were a negotiation, and she refused to negotiate with men who'd already made their decision to destroy her. She turned to the chart instead, her hand moving across the pages with the same clinical precision she'd used to save Vickers' life. Time of cardiac arrest, 0202. Method of resuscitation, open cardiac massage via left anterolateral thoracotomy. Medication administered, 1 mg epinephrine for push at 0207. Return of spontaneous circulation, 0221. Vital signs at resuscitation, BP 95/60, heart rate 128, oxygen saturation 92%. All documented. All irrefutable. All enough to destroy her nursing license by morning. Ashford was still watching her. He didn't move closer or farther away, he simply occupied the space like a man who was still calculating how to use this moment. Amy, the first-year nurse, had pressed herself against the far wall, her face the color of old bone, her hands trembling in a way Danielle's never would. The monitor beeped steadily, Vickers' breathing synchronized with the ventilator, his color improving, his body responding to the intervention that should have been impossible for a nurse to perform. Should have been. Wasn't. You understand, Ashford said, still studying the chart, that this ends you. Completely. Danielle met his eyes. Held them. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't offer anything remotely resembling an apology. This was the moment where men like Ashford expected nurses to crumble, to justify, to beg for mercy. Instead, she simply turned back to the monitor and adjusted the flow rate by 0.2 milliliters per hour. Precision. Competence. Defiance wrapped in professionalism. Ashford disappeared. She continued monitoring Vickers through the next hour. His pressure climbed to 98/60 seconds at 0430. O2 saturation holding steady at 94%. Heart rate stabilizing at 116. The bleeding had stopped. The organs that had been screaming in septic shock were beginning to listen. She checked his pupils, reactive, equal, round. She palpated his abdomen carefully, assessing the incision site for any sign of infection or leakage. Nothing. Clean closure. Professional work. The kind of work that took training most nurses didn't have and all nurses weren't permitted to do. At 05:45, her phone buzzed. A text from Ryan, "How's your shift, Mom?" She didn't answer. There were no words for this moment. Her phone went dark in her scrub pocket, next to the cracked Air Force Challenge coin she kept there, the one stamped with her unit insignia from Ramadi. The rain started outside, hammering against the ICU windows like someone trying to break through. It wasn't the gentle rainfall of early morning, it was heavy, aggressive, the kind of rain that comes before a storm. Thunder rolled across Norfolk in the distance, and for a moment Danielle closed her eyes and listened to it, imagining it was something else. Imagining it was the sound of a Black Hawk landing, not the sound of her life ending. At 0600, 2 security officers appeared at the ICU entrance. They were young, uncomfortable, apologetic. One of them, the taller one with the nervous eyes, held a white envelope. He extended it toward Danielle without making eye contact. "We're sorry. We have orders to escort you out." Dr. Ashford's request. She took the envelope without a word. Opened it. Read the letterhead, Seattle General Human Resources. The letter was dated that morning, 05 for 5 hours, 15 minutes ago, signed by Ashford and the hospital attorney. Gross violations of scope of practice. Insubordination. Willful endangerment. Terminated effective immediately. Security escort required. 12 hours on shift. 12 hours bringing a dying man back from the edge. This was her reward. The walk to her locker felt longer than it should have. The hospital corridors were almost empty at this hour, just the night shift nurses passing through, the cleaning crew pushing their carts, the occasional orderly with a fresh pot of coffee. Nobody looked up. Nobody stopped her. She was already disappearing, becoming a ghost in the building where she'd worked for 3 years, the woman Dr. Ashford had erased in the time it took to sign a termination letter. Her locker was on the 3rd floor, 2 doors down from where Ashford had made his announcement about her demotion. She packed a cardboard box, the kind the hospital used for supply donations. Her cracked Air Force mug, the one that said 3rd Aeromedical Evacuation Squadron, Ramadi on the side. A dying succulent that Amy had given her last Christmas, its leaves brittle and brown but still clinging to the stem. A photograph in a plastic frame, 8 faces, her medic team from Ramadi, 2009. Sergeant Torres on the left, killed by IED shrapnel in Fallujah. Corporal Mitchell in the middle back, suicide 3 years ago in Tacoma. Petty Officer Chen on the right, medically discharged with PTSD worse than her own. For who made it home? For who didn't? All of them younger than she'd been then. The rain started as she walked out of the hospital, a cardboard box balanced on her knees, her scrub soaked through within 30 seconds. The water was cold, running down her neck in rivulets, soaking into the box. By the time she reached the bus stop 6 blocks away, the cardboard was soft, beginning to disintegrate. The photograph was getting wet, the edges curling, the faces beginning to blur. She sat on the bench, watching the sky lighten over Seattle General. The rain hammered down around her, turning the street into a river, and she thought about wounds. Not the kind that bled bright red and needed stitches. The kind that never closed. The kind that learned to bleed so quietly that nobody ever noticed until you were already empty. Medically discharged. That's what they called it when a convoy was ambushed and shrapnel tore through your shoulder at 7,000 miles per hour and took 3 years of surgery and physical therapy just to regain 50% mobility. Medically discharged, which meant they couldn't use you anymore, which meant you went back to America to figure out who you were when you weren't Major Danielle Ross anymore, when you were just a person who'd learned to hold people together when everything was falling apart. She'd spent 7 years rebuilding herself as a civilian. Nursing school. Certification. 3 years at Seattle General, keeping her head down, letting younger nurses take credit for the work she did, accepting the nickname Danny the Band-Aid Girl without flinching because that was the deal you made when you wanted to disappear. Stay quiet. Don't let anyone know. Don't let anyone see the scar tissue under the uniform. Just be a nurse. Just save people. Don't ask for recognition. Don't expect gratitude. She'd rebuilt her life precisely so she'd never have to explain why a major was emptying bedpans, changing fours, taking insults from doctors who'd never seen a patient die in their arms. Precisely so she'd never have to see the pity in people's eyes when they realized the trauma surgeon was now working as a floor nurse because the shrapnel had taken the last 3 centimeters of her deltoid and the army had no use for broken equipment. The rain soaked through the cardboard box. Water ran down her knees, dripping onto the asphalt. The photograph from Ramadi was dissolving in her hands, the faces becoming watercolor abstracts. They'd been real for so long, and now they were becoming something else. Something that couldn't hurt anymore because it was barely a memory. Some wounds never stop bleeding, she thought. They just learn to bleed quietly. So quietly that nobody notices. So quietly that you're already gone before anyone realizes you're dying. She sat at the bus stop as Norfolk woke up around her. The rain kept falling. The cardboard box kept falling apart. And somewhere in Seattle General, Commander James Vickers opened his eyes in the ICU and saw a monitor displaying his heartbeat, a heart that was beating because a nurse with a scar on her shoulder and a dog tag in her pocket had refused to let him die, no matter what it cost her to save him. She had no idea what was about to walk through those hospital doors. Ryan showed up at the hospital board meeting that afternoon, 17 years old and shaking, carrying a shadow box. His hands trembled as he set it on the polished conference table in front of the assembled board members, their faces arranged in the careful expressions of people about to hear uncomfortable testimony. Dr. Ashford was already speaking, his voice surgical and cold as a scalpel. Major Ross exercised gross violations of scope of practice. She performed an invasive procedure without authorization, without proper backup, he stopped. Everyone was staring at the shadow box. Ryan's jaw clenched. He opened it slowly, letting the afternoon light catch the medals inside. A silver star lay first, pinned to burgundy ribbon. Then 2 bronze stars. A purple heart with its distinctive profile. Campaign ribbons arranged like a color-coded history of 2 continents and 14 years of service that nobody in this room had bothered to research before calling his mother Danny the Band-Aid Girl 3 hours before she saved a man's life. "They need to see these," Ryan said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled precision of someone who'd been raised by a woman who understood that silence was sometimes the sharpest weapon. Mrs. Chen, the hospital attorney, leaned forward. Her hand reached toward the shadow box, then paused, a gesture that asked permission. Ryan nodded. She lifted the frame with both hands, the way someone might carry something sacred. The board members stood without being told to stand. One by one, they came around the table to look. Ashford remained seated, his face already calculating angles, already constructing the narrative where the medals didn't matter, where the procedure was still insubordination, where a major was still just a nurse who'd overstepped. Mrs. Chen's voice trembled as she read from the file in her hands. Major Danielle Ross. United States Air Force. 14 years of active service. 2 combat deployments. She turned a page. Silver Star for valor under fire. Bronze Star for leadership in mass casualty situations. Another Bronze Star for, her voice caught slightly, for holding a trauma bay together while the building was under siege. Purple Heart. Purple Heart again. She looked up from the file. 2 of them. The room was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song. Ashford opened his mouth. No sound came out. The attorney continued, her tone shifting to something harder, more clinical. Major Ross was assigned to a combat support hospital near Ramadi. Medical records here document that she managed 47 trauma cases in a single 24-hour period during a coordinated insurgent attack. 47. She set the file down. This hospital documented in her termination letter that she violated scope of practice by performing an emergency thoracotomy on a patient in cardiac arrest with no surgical backup available. She looked at Ashford directly now. That thoracotomy is a standard trauma response that she performed at least 40 times in the field. 40 times. And every single time, someone who would have bled out on the sand got to go home to their family because Major Ross knew the difference between rules and keeping people alive. And that was when the doors opened. Commander Vickers walked through in dress uniform, pale and moving with the careful precision of a man still on pain medication, still healing from having his chest opened by a trauma knife and hands that knew exactly where to find a human heart that had stopped beating. The uniform meant something. It was his way of telling the board that he wasn't a patient, wasn't a victim requiring sympathy. He was command. He was witness. He was the reason that Ryan's mother was sitting in a rain-soaked parking lot at dawn with her life in a disintegrating cardboard box. Major Ross held my heart in her hand last night, Vickers said, his voice steady in a way that made the board members pull back slightly. Just like she held mine in Ramadi when I was a lieutenant bleeding out in her tent. He paused. The image hung in the air, 2 versions of the same man, separated by 16 years and a single dog tag. If you think 12 hours is a long shift, she once worked 36 straight while the building was under siege. 36. Without stopping. Without her, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be breathing. He looked directly at Ashford. And I sure as hell wouldn't be standing in front of you right now. Ashford tried to speak again. This time, he managed something, a defense, a deflection, a handful of words about protocol and licensing boards and the authority structure that had protected him for 8 years while he cultivated board relationships instead of medical competence. The words fell like rain on concrete. They didn't land. They didn't stick. Everyone was watching him now the way you watch an animal that's realized too late that it walked into a cage. The next sound was shoes on tile, 2 of them, approaching in a rhythm that made Ashford's eyes snap up. Special Agent Morrison entered first, her FBI credentials catching the light as she opened them. Behind her came Special Agent Keller, carrying a manila folder that looked thicker than the hospital's entire quality assurance manual. Dr. Ashford, Morrison said, her voice carrying the flat precision of federal power, we've been investigating discrepancies in patient outcome reporting at Seattle General for 6 months. She opened the folder. Photographs. Documents. Redacted and underlined and stamped with official seals. You've been forging quality reports. Falsifying patient records to protect your statistics and board standing. Commander Vickers' case triggered an audit. She held up a document. Ashford's signature was there, repeated, inconsistent. You altered nursing documentation. Deleted pages from physician orders. Attempted to obstruct federal investigators reviewing a military service member's care. Ashford's face drained to the color of fresh gauze. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again like a fish pulled from water, gasping at air it couldn't breathe. That's, I can explain. Keller stepped forward, handcuffs catching the conference room light. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The cuffs closed around Ashford's wrists with a sound like a door locking on a life that was already over. His expensive watch caught the light, a $12,000 Rolex that suddenly looked like evidence of something worse than vanity. The perp walk took him past the nurse's station on the 3rd floor. The nurse's station where he'd made those calls. Where he'd reassigned staffing with a single sentence. Where he'd announced Danielle's demotion in front of 12 colleagues and listened to them laugh. Every phone in the hallway came out. 12 colleagues who remembered standing in that parking lot watched him being escorted toward the elevator in handcuffs, his expensive shoes clicking against tile that he used to own, his surgeon's hands trembling like a first-year resident's hands on their first code. The overhead speaker crackled. A nurse's voice, young, female, barely suppressing laughter, "Security, we need coffee in the lobby." "Oh wait, never mind. We're good. We're actually great. Security's already handling everything." Ashford's face went red. The automatic doors opened like they were welcoming an arrival. Instead, they were swallowing a disappearance. The glass closed behind him. Inside the hospital, the conference room remained utterly silent. Mrs. Chen presented the remainder of the investigation in a voice that had found its authority again. Full systematic pattern. Board allies installed on quality committees. Connections leveraged to suppress complaints. Staff targeted who threatened his reputation. One complaint had been buried for 18 months. One investigation had been delayed. One patient's file had been altered again, then finally deleted from the system entirely. Dr. Ashford installed what amounts to a protection apparatus, Mrs. Chen said, using institutional power to obstruct accountability. She closed the file. Major Ross was fired for saving a patient's life using combat trauma techniques that civilian protocols don't even recognize because those protocols were written by people who've never held someone's beating heart in their hands while shells impacted 300 meters away. The vote was unanimous. Full reinstatement. Back pay. A formal apology written in language that legal required but the board members understood meant something much deeper, a recognition that they had allowed a man in a white coat to weaponize their authority against someone who'd worn a uniform they didn't know how to read. Ryan kept the shadow box. Vickers kept his dog tags. And somewhere in Norfolk, Danielle Ross sat at a bus stop in the rain, still not knowing that her son had walked into a hospital board meeting and forced the entire institution to look at who she actually was. Hit like and subscribe if you're enjoying this. And I'm always curious, drop a comment and tell us if you're watching from a big city or a small town. Now let's continue the story.